Ibrahim Traoré's views on France and Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, what does it truly mean to be free? What does it mean for a nation to stand tall, to walk forward not as a shadow under another's flag, but with its own stride, its own voice, and its own destiny? Stay with me until the end, because what you'll hear today is not just a story about one man or two nations. It is the awakening of a people, the rebirth of a continent, and the call for every listener to rise. Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin by exploring a truth that too many have been taught to overlook. The silent chains of colonialism do not always rattle. Sometimes they are velvet lined. Sometimes they are hidden behind trade agreements, diplomatic gestures, or the illusion of mutual benefit. Ibrahim Traoré's voice has cut through that illusion not with bitterness, but with clarity. He speaks to a generation raised on slogans of independence but still navigating systems designed long before they were born. He is part of a wave of leaders who are not content with ceremonial sovereignty. They are reaching for real freedom not just from foreign rule, but from inherited submission. For decades, France maintained not just a political grip over its former colonies in Africa, but also an economic and psychological hold that has proven far more enduring. The colonial structures were dismantled, yet the control mechanisms remained. Through currency, dependency, military bases, cultural indoctrination, and development programs skewed in favor of French interests, a form of neocolonialism survived, clever, quiet, and deeply entrenched. In this context, Traoré's defiance isn't just political, it's symbolic. He represents the refusal to continue in a relationship that presents itself as partnership but functions as dominance. He questions the status quo that has been sold as stability but functions as stagnation. You see, when a leader like Traoré challenges French influence in Burkina Faso, it isn't only about geopolitics, it's about identity. It's about restoring dignity to a people who, for too long, were expected to be grateful for chains that were polished instead of broken. He is not afraid to ask, why are African countries still using a currency like the CFA franc and controlled by their former colonizer? Why are strategic national decisions still being made with Paris in mind rather than Ouagadougou or Bamako? These are the uncomfortable questions that true independence demands. These are the questions that ignite change. But the heart of his message doesn't beat only in confrontation. It beats in construction. It calls for building new paths, free from dependency. And that brings us to a crucial pillar of his worldview. The idea that alliances must serve the people, not the past. In the modern world, no nation exists in isolation. Global cooperation is essential, but it must be guided by mutual respect, not historical guilt or external pressure. Traoré's approach to Russia is not about abandoning one master for another. It is about ending the idea of masters altogether. It is about forming pragmatic alliances that elevate the country's defense, infrastructure, and economy without compromising sovereignty. When Traoré speaks positively of Russia, it is because he sees a willingness to engage without condescension. Where France's presence often came with strings-attached military protection tied to political silence, or aid linked to economic servitude, Russia offers a different model. Whether or not one agrees with every aspect of that engagement, the principle behind it is crucial. Africa must be free to choose its partners. Burkina Faso must be free to determine its alliances based on what empowers its people, not what pleases its past colonizers. This is not anti-Western rhetoric. It is pro-African empowerment. And let us be honest, this idea makes many uncomfortable because it disrupts decades of silent consent. It shifts the narrative from Africa as a receiver of favors to Africa as a builder of futures. It forces the world to look at the continent not as a charity case, but as a strategic player. In choosing to engage with nations that do not carry colonial baggage, Traoré is resetting the terms of engagement. He is saying we will not be trapped by history, we will write a new chapter. And that chapter starts with partnerships that reflect respect, not superiority. Now, let us move deeper, not just into politics or foreign affairs, but into the soul of the continent. Traoré's message isn't confined to presidential addresses or military reforms. It reaches into the homes, the schools, the streets, and most importantly, into the minds of the youth. Because if there is one truth that resounds in all he stands for, it is this: the liberation of Africa is not a task for presidents alone. It is a mission for the people, and especially the youth. Again and again, he calls upon the young to awaken not just politically, but intellectually and spiritually. He reminds them that they are not powerless heirs of a broken system. They are the architects of what comes next. He doesn't flatter them with easy praise. He challenges them with responsibility. He tells them, your energy must not only entertain but educate. Your strengths must not only fight but build. Your voice must not only echo frustrations but design solutions. In a continent where millions are under 25, the power to change isn't distant, it's present. It's breathing, it's now. But it requires a shift in mindset, from victims to visionaries. Traoré is not romantic about this task. He knows the obstacles: poverty, corruption, misinformation, fear, but he also knows the power of purpose. When he addresses the youth, there is urgency in his words, but also hope. He speaks as someone who understands what it means to rise from obscurity, to refuse submission, to challenge a system that says this is just the way things are. He is living proof that one person, armed with conviction and clarity, can unsettle entire narratives that have ruled for generations. He speaks of education not merely as schooling, but as awakening, because a system that fails to teach history, truthfully, that hides the crimes of colonization, and that glorifies dependency, cannot produce free thinkers. He urges the youth to read their own stories, study their own heroes, learn from their own ancestors, because in the restoration of historical truth lies the birth of authentic pride. And with pride comes power, the power to stand, to speak, to lead. This isn't idealism, it's strategy. A nation whose youth are conscious is a nation that cannot be fooled. A continent whose young minds are trained in critical thought, not colonial obedience, is a continent that will no longer sell its land for crumbs or exchange its soul for applause. Traoré calls for the kind of education that prepares minds for innovation, not imitation, that builds entrepreneurs, engineers, scientists, philosophers, not just employees for foreign companies or cheerleaders for foreign ideals. And let us be clear, this awakening is not about rejecting the world. It's about entering it with self-respect. It's about saying we bring something to the table. It's about no longer asking for seats in rooms where decisions are made about us without us, but building new rooms altogether. This is the spirit of Pan-African pride, rooted not in arrogance, but in awareness. When Traoré rejects manipulation, when he chooses new partners, when he empowers the youth, it is not a series of isolated acts. It is a coherent vision, a vision of an Africa that remembers its past, commands its present, and reclaims its future. It is a call to stop waiting for validation and start creating value. And in every one of these messages, there is a challenge. To each of us, are we thinking for ourselves, or through the lens we've been handed? Are we following a path, or forging one? This is why his message resonates far beyond Burkina Faso, because it taps into something universal, the longing that belong to something greater than fear. The hunger for freedom, not just from external powers, but from the internal chains of doubt and dependence. In a world where so many feel lost between histories they did not choose and futures they cannot see, Traoré's clarity becomes a compass. And it is with that compass that we now move forward to understand not only the courage to defy, or the wisdom to choose, or the power to awaken, but also the daring required to break free from comfort. Because the journey of transformation does not reward the passive. It rewards those who are willing to let go of the familiar and walk into the fire of responsibility. And that fire will be the focus of what comes next. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a truth that echoes across every nation, every people, every generation. The most powerful force for transformation is not leadership from above, but movement from within. Ibrahim Traoré understands this with crystal clarity. When he speaks to the youth of Burkina Faso, he is not simply offering encouragement, he is delivering a command, a mission, a wake-up call to rise and recognize the vast untapped power that exists in every young mind and heart. Because the future of a continent as rich, vibrant, and diverse as Africa cannot be determined, will not be determined by those who have long exploited it. It will be forged by those who believe in its potential and are willing to pay the price for its liberation. And that responsibility lies heavily on the shoulders of the youth. Not because they are the majority, which they are, but because they represent a moment that cannot be delayed. Traoré sees the youth not as the leaders of tomorrow, but as the leaders of now. He refuses to accept the idea that age is a prerequisite for wisdom or action. Instead, he speaks directly to the young woman in the village who reads by candlelight, to the young man selling in the market with a phone full of ideas, to the student questioning outdated textbooks, to the artist using his voice to speak truths too dangerous for politics. He tells them, you are the guardians of a new Africa. Not one drawn from foreign blueprints, but one born from the soil of your own struggle, your own intellect, your own dreams. But dreaming is not enough. That is one of the most vital and often overlooked parts of Traoré's message. In many societies, youth are told to wait their turn, to be patient, to first receive permission. That mindset, he warns, is not culture, it is conditioning. Conditioning to believe that obedience is a virtue, that silence is safety, that questioning is disrespect. Traoré wants to shatter that illusion. Because revolutions are not polite, change does not ask permission, and freedom does not come to those who sit and hope, it comes to those who act, who learn, who organize, who stand even when they stand alone. He does not call for rebellion without purpose. He calls for conscious leadership in every home, school, and street. He wants youth to educate themselves, not just to pass exams, but to understand systems. He wants them to know history, not the colonial version, but the buried truths of resistance, innovation, and sacrifice. He wants them to see leadership not as a privilege of the elite, but as a responsibility of every citizen. In this vision, everyone has a role. The farmer feeds the nation with pride. The teacher builds minds like fortresses. The engineer creates roads not just from point A to point B, but from poverty to progress. This is not romanticism, it is strategy. A country where every youth understands their value is a country no enemy can divide. No foreign power can control, no corrupt leader can manipulate. And yet all of this, the awakening of youth, the shift in alliances, the rejection of old empires comes with risk, great risk, because systems do not fall quietly. Those who benefit from control do not surrender it willingly. That is why Traoré's fourth great message, and perhaps the most difficult, is about courage. The courage to break away from dependency, not just political dependency on former colonial powers, but mental, emotional, and economic dependency. Because dependency is comfortable, it comes with familiar rules. It often brings short-term rewards, aid, stability, security, but it brings long-term paralysis. It robs nations of the ability to think creatively, to act decisively, to build authentically. When Traoré began to distance Burkina Faso from French military presence and influence, there was no shortage of critics. Warnings of chaos, of collapse, of isolation flooded the media, but he did not retreat. Not because he had guarantees of success, but because he knew the price of continued dependence was greater than the risk of freedom. This is the kind of leadership that inspires, not because it promises comfort, but because it dares to face discomfort. Traoré understands that the path to true sovereignty is not lined with applause, it is lined with obstacles, resistance, and fear, and yet he walks it. That is the essence of courage. And courage is not just for presidents or soldiers. It is for every citizen who decides to say no to corruption, to think critically, to choose honesty over convenience. It is for communities who choose self-reliance over handouts, for entrepreneurs who build with local materials instead of importing foreign solutions, for parents who teach their children to speak their mother tongue with pride. Courage is not only found in confrontation, it is found in the everyday choices that shift a nation's direction, inch by inch. Traoré's message is clear. A people who choose courage over comfort become unstoppable, and in that spirit, he speaks not only to individuals but to the continent as a whole. The fifth message that reverberates through his leadership is one of unity, not political slogans, but real, strategic Pan-African solidarity. He understands that no single African nation can stand completely free if its neighbors are still shackled, that the borders drawn by colonial rulers are artificial lines meant to divide what was once whole. He dreams, and more importantly, works, for a continent where countries collaborate not out of desperation, but out of vision, where resources are shared, where security is collective, where identity is rooted in African excellence, not Western acceptance. This Pan-African vision is not new, but Traoré breathes urgency into it. He looks around and sees a new generation of African leaders, many young, bold, and unafraid, who are beginning to speak the same language of sovereignty, of dignity, of rebirth, and he knows that time is of the essence. For too long, Africa has been a battleground for foreign powers fighting for influence, from Europe to Asia to the Americas. But now, he says, it must become a platform for African strength, and that strength lies not in mimicry, but in authenticity, not in division, but in unity. To the youth, he says, do not look across oceans for salvation. Look next door. Partner with your African brothers and sisters. Trade with them. Learn from them. Defend each other, because unity is not just about grand gestures, it's about building networks, sharing technology, solving problems together. And yes, it's about standing together when the world pushes back. When Traoré expelled French forces and faced backlash, it was neighboring nations that stood by him. That solidarity is not just symbolic, it is strategic. Because an Africa united can no longer be manipulated. An Africa that speaks with one voice cannot be ignored. But there is a battle still raging, a quiet one, but perhaps the most dangerous of all. It is the battle between fear and freedom. Every great transformation faces this war. Because freedom is not only about external liberation, it is about internal resolve. Too many have been taught, directly or indirectly, that the price of freedom is too high, that it is safer to obey, to accept, to survive, that rising will bring retaliation, that speaking truth will lead to punishment. This fear is not unfounded, is born from generations of trauma. But Traoré's voice enters this fear with the message that cuts through the fog: freedom is always worth it. He knows that choosing freedom means facing isolation, losing foreign aid, being targeted by global narratives. But he reminds his people and all of us that the cost of continued submission is far greater. Submission kills hope, it erases ambition, it numbs identity, it convinces the powerful that they are powerless, and that he will not accept. That, he tells the youth, must end with us. Because once a people believe in their right to determine their destiny, no force on earth can stop them. They may be delayed, they may be attacked, but they cannot be defeated. This is not just a message for Africa, it is a message for the world. For every community that has been told they are too small, too poor, too weak to matter. For every a person who has been told to wait, to follow, to stay quiet. For every nation that has been made to feel like a burden instead of a blessing. Traoré's defiance is not reckless, it is responsible. It says to every one of us, stand up, speak out, build, because the world you want is not given, it is made. And that world is not some far-off dream. It begins with action, it begins with knowledge, it begins with unity. And it continues, as we will now explore, with a deeper understanding of history, of identity, and of the sacred responsibility we all share to remember what came before so that we may build what must come next. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just about geopolitics. This is about mindset, about self-worth, about the battle between comfort and courage. Traoré's views are not just for leaders. They're for anyone who has ever felt trapped by fear, doubt, or the legacy of the past. If a nation can rise from the grip of history, so can you. If a leader can say enough, then so can we. Don't just listen, reflect, question, act. Because when one nation stands, others follow. And when a continent rises, the world must listen. Thank you.